Welcome to the Learner-Centered Collaborative Podcast. I am your host, Katie Martin, and I am so excited to have Shane Safir here with me today. For more than 20 years, Shane has worked at every level of the education system, from the classroom to the boardroom, bringing passion, skill, and unique solutions to the challenge of school transformation and the promise of educational opportunity for every child. I love that. In 2003, Shane became the founding co-principal at San Francisco's June Jordan School for Equity, a cutting-edge national model quoted by leading scholar Linda Darling-Hammond, who love, as having beaten the odds in supporting the success of low-income students of color. For over 10 years, she has provided coaching, facilitation, and professional development for hundreds of leaders in schools, school districts, and educational organizations across the country and Canada. An innovator at heart with a rare combination of leadership and instructional expertise, Shane's voice resonates with educators who want to reinvent their schools and organizations into places of equitable learning. She's a frequent contributor to Edutopia and ASCD's educational leadership, and has two books that have been very pivotal in the education ecosystem. The first, The Listening Leader, Creating the Conditions for Equitable School Transformation. And the second book with Dr. Jamila Dugan is Street Data, Next Generation Model for Equity, Pedagogy, and School Transformation, which we're going to dive into a lot today. So welcome, Shane. I could not be more excited to have you here and really look forward to diving in. I am so excited. I love your work, and I know so many other people do, which gives me such hope for the future of education. So welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, and I appreciate the invitation.
Great. So let's just start how I love to start these podcasts. Share a little bit about who you are and some of your key experiences that have really shaped you as an educator and a leader.
Yeah, thanks for that invitation to begin with story, which is how Jamila and I often begin our workshops, and how Asin and I begin our podcast as well. So I am, first and foremost, the daughter of David Safir and Kim Fredericks, who was born Kim Blackman, and I'm the great-granddaughter of John and Johanna Joyce from Ireland, and Chaim Popkin and Fanny Popkin from Eastern Europe, immigrants, Jewish and Irish folks who came to the States to kind of came from villages and then really formed urban villages in a time many generations before I was born, but I think with rooting in values of relationality and interconnectedness that I think in some way live in my DNA, right? That I really hold dear and feel really intuitive to me. When I think about how I grew up and was preparing for this podcast, due to structural racism and the birth of the suburbs in the wake of World War II, I ended up, growing up in this sort of strange suburban environment that was really, in many ways, really homogenous and really alienating. And I think I never quite felt at home there. So I went as far as I could find on the American map for college, for university back east, and had a lot of experiences of awakening that shaped the lenses I hold as an educator. And so I'll talk about a couple of those. One is I was privileged to intern with a civil rights attorney at the end of my college career, who was representing all of the juvenile inmates in the state of Rhode Island. So I wrote about this a little bit in my first book. And that experience every week walking into, through the clanging gates of the Rhode Island Training School for Youth, which was a youth prison with a euphemistic name, and getting to know young people who were so bright and had so much potential, and, really this feeling of their communities being colonized by the prison system. And then this awakening as a young white person that, wow, the young folks in this prison have done all the same kind of things that the teenagers I grew up with did, but none of them ended up in the system, right? And that kind of starkness of racial injustice and structural racism, hit me squarely in the face and shaped, I think, a lifelong aspiration to be a co-conspirator and to try to work across difference and for justice, something I'm still, aspiring to. And I don't think you ever arrive as someone with privilege. So that's one experience that comes to mind. And then, as a young teacher, I was part of a project that was actually featured in a documentary on KQED or public television. And I was teaching in a big urban public high school in San Francisco, and we partnered with a very elite private school in Marin County, and our students met each other and they visited each other's campuses and they spent the night. We did like a weekend retreat. It was so wacky. And they formed this sense of shared purpose and a desire to disrupt the system. And it was really, really powerful to witness and be a part of as a young teacher, and to watch students become agentic and find their voices. And I think many elements of that experience also show up, formally and informally in street data. There's so many other things. I don't want to spend all the time on this question, but I could stop there. If you want, I could share a little bit about the birth of June Jordan. Totally up to you.
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear a little bit about the birth of June Jordan.
Okay. So I guess the last experience I could share that really has honed my lens as a writer and an educator is the years leading up to the founding of June Jordan School for Equity, where I was a co-principal for the first 4 years. So we actually partnered with a local community organizing group, SFOP, San Francisco Organizing Project, that's part of a larger national network, PICO. Mm-hmm. And I took a year off of teaching. I think I lived on like a $20,000 grant that year and was an organizer. I learned to organize and build power in the community. And so I spent that year in the living rooms of hundreds of folks, families in Southeast San Francisco, just listening, inviting people's dreams, hearing their stories about what wasn't working in the public schools in San Francisco, and moving toward building a collective vision of this new school, which became eventually, through a lot of political kind of warfare, became June Jordan School for Equity. And so I think about that era a lot, in that the values of listening, the values of humility, the power of collective vision versus individual vision, all I think really, solidified for me in that experience.
I'm so glad I asked. It's, as you started to share your roots, I often think, go back to the beginning, but you went back to, the roots in your family in Ireland and Eastern Europe. And I love that because a couple of years ago, I got to go visit Ireland, where my family is from, with my dad. And it was a really cool experience to be back there and to kind of trace our roots and heritage. And my husband's about to do the same. So thank you for sharing that. I also, as you were talking about your experience in Rhode Island and your experience with the youth prison, it made me think I went the opposite direction. So I went to Hawaii to teach, right? So out of college, my experience that was very disrupting. And as a young person and new teacher, I remember getting to know my students and talking to them, and they were like, "Miss, we're from Eva Beach. No one cares about us." And I remember thinking that, like, I care about you, like, stop everything. How it was just kind of an offhand comment that one of my students made. And coming from, middle-class suburbs in Southern California, I also saw those same experiences that my students were engaged in, the middle school shenanigans, in some ways that I thought, we did the same thing, and we got a slap on the wrist, we got a detention, and my kids were often being hauled off by the cops. They were in line, and I just thought, this didn't happen when I was in school. And so it really just shook me also to think about the differences in where kids grow up and how they see themselves and how they see their opportunities. And it's important to shift that, because it's really formed my perspective on, of course you matter. Of course you matter. And how do we help you to see that and know that, and create a system that really honors that? So I think that's a lot about this conversation today.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that connection.
So your first book, you mentioned this a little bit, The Listening Leader and Street Data are really anchored in listening. There's, different avenues. But in the prologue of Street Data, when I was rereading it, there's a statement or a couple sentences that caught my eye. You said, if we listen to the policy wavelength, the system is falling apart without its usual architecture. But if we listen to educators on the ground, the system itself is self-correcting and humanizing itself in a yearning for reinvention. So tell me a little bit more, like, what are you, as you're listening and as you're learning, what are you seeing out there that's helping you to see this shifting?
It's a little sad to hear that now because I was writing it in a really different moment, right?
Mhm.
In the middle of the pandemic when it felt like there was nothing but possibility to let go of some of
Yeah.
the oppressive and dysfunctional systems. And in many ways, it feels like, to use Jamila's frame of boomerang equity, that we boomerang back to a lot of the traditional structures that don't
Mhm.
serve and work for kids. I think the counter narrative to what I just said is that I do see a shift in the larger discourse in terms of really centering who students are, what they need, the social emotional dimensions of learning, the mental health, like it's unavoidable, right? The
Yeah.
mental health impact of COVID. So I think that there's still opening. But when school buildings opened, it felt like the system, instead of reinventing itself, just kind of regressed, right,
Yeah.
to the bell schedule and the periods and the kind of modularization of learning. And one of the sort of what's the word I'm looking for, like incontrovertible impacts of that is that we are just losing teachers and
Yeah.
principals, right, more and more. I have some hope in that there's such an appetite for this work and this framework. And it's not so much about the book, but I think people are just really hungering for new ways to talk about success, new ways to
Yes.
move toward equity, new ways to slow down and um, root their decision making in student voice,
Mhm.
student experience. And so that gives me some hope, but I do feel like the larger kind of like macro system just re-erected itself really in the
Yeah.
wake of the pandemic. So we're in this weird purgatory, I feel like, in education.
Yeah. And we'll get more to the redefining success, but I do want to touch on, you said we're losing principals and teachers, but I also think we're losing students more and more, right? So
Yeah.
as we come back to these structures that many data, many experiences highlight weren't working before the pandemic, right? Now we're coming back and trying to put them back in place. And, in many ways, people have noted shoving the genie back in the bottle, right? Trying to, when kids and educators have had different experiences, now we're trying to come back and say, okay, we have to come back to these structured experiences. And teachers are frustrated. They're saying, I had freedom and flexibility. And a lot of people are leaving their jobs because they want more flexibility and they want more autonomy in how they structure their days. But if you come back to being a teacher, you can't really be human. You can't go to the doctor. You can't take a break. You can't, be sick because it's really hard to do sub plans and all these things. So a lot of teachers are really struggling with that. But at the same time, we keep hearing the behaviors of kids are so bad, and kids are struggling to pay attention because they've also had more flexibility and they didn't need to learn the moment that someone said they needed to learn or go through that chapter in a book. And so I think that there is that opportunity to really rethink our systems, because it's not that they're not just working for teachers, they're really not working for a lot of people. So that is where I see the hope that there is a possibility of like, okay, people are starting to realize we have to be thinking about this a different way.
I think so. I think so. I mean, one data point that's popping into my brain right now is, so my son, who's here in BC, finishing high school, was an independent study student in 8th grade in Oakland Unified School District, which is where my home is. And at that point, I think that program probably had like 100 to not more than 200 kids. And more recently, I heard from, I think it was the superintendent who told me there's over 1,000 young people enrolled, which is really interesting, right? Because I think it's primarily an online program now. But think about that exponential increase in the number of families and young people who are seeking a different experience,
Yeah.
and what we could do if we gave ourselves permission to not just have them an independent study, but to rethink schooling through the lens of what do you really want and need, students, families, et cetera. I think we could do some amazing design work.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that there's, Education Reimagined is really tapping into these big ideas and the learning ecosystem to think about not just you have to stay in one school or, these options on the periphery, but if we really rethink our public education system and meeting the needs of each of the learners, I think there's a lot of great opportunities. And like you said, we just have to give ourselves permission because the opportunities are there. So as I was reading that quote and as I was thinking about, I mentioned that I was in Hawaii last week and I had this experience that I would love your perspective on. So we were working with these charter schools who have these beautiful vision and missions to meet the needs of their unique communities, Indigenous communities, place-based. They're doing really incredible work. But if you look at the satellite data, we'll use your metaphor. If we look at the satellite data, you would see these schools are failing by basically all metrics, not all of them, but one in particular. So we were looking at it before we went to visit. And then I walk on campus expecting things to be really dreary. And I walk on campus and there's pure joy from the front office staff. The students, the keiki are just like hugging, they're running, they're excited, they're reading, they're they're like creating gardens. And got me thinking about this disconnect between the data, between the stories we tell about schools and what's actually happening on the ground in many places. As I walk into schools, I don't see often that negativity that the data might present. So I'm wondering, kind of as with this example, what are some other ways that you're seeing people tell the stories, or even are you seeing the same experience around the data being totally different than the experience of the school?
That's like a really big question. And
it is a big question.
And I just had the opportunity to interview Linda and Kia Darling-Hammond for my podcast a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things we asked about the impact of the test and punish era on schools and on learning. Mm-hmm. And Linda, who's of course brilliant and a thought leader for decades in the field, went on a riff about test questions and these standardized tests and the sort of like inherent bias baked into them, mm-hmm. and how they're double discriminatory, because if enough kids do well on them, they're taken out. If kids who are predicted to do poorly, aka students at the margins, often BIPOC students, do well on them, they're taken out. And so the reinforcement of this kind of bell curve hierarchical model of achievement. So I think to answer that question, I mean, we have to go down to the root of it all, which, as I talk about in chapter 1, and Jamila and I often talk about in the work, is really about epistemology. It's about what are ideas about knowledge, mm-hmm. knowing, about what even constitutes data, what's a valid and reliable metric, right? And I feel like in Western education in general, but more so in the States, there's just been this disproportionate focus on the satellite data. And it's a very singular story. And to me, it just reinforces, as you said, this sort of deficit narrative about schools that serve students at the margins. So what I would say is a little bit contradictory, which is, on the one hand, I don't think we're advocating to completely eradicate satellite measures. Mm-hmm. I think we need to rethink them. I think we need to right-size them. For example, here in British Columbia, students take far fewer standardized tests. They're episodic, they're no stakes. They don't take a lot of time. Teachers aren't orienting to prep students for them all the time. So that's that piece. And then at the same time as we're right-sizing the satellite data, I think we need to be growing these frameworks for street level data. Right. And so what are we measuring and why? Well, you mentioned joy. So what would it mean to have joy as a central metric, right, of school transformation, or quote unquote success, which is a word I've been interrogating internally for a while. I'm not sure that's even the right word anymore. What would it mean to center student well-being as a core metric, right?
Would be amazing.
Pedagogy absolutely orients, right? And
Yeah.
epistemology orients us toward well-being above whatever westernized notions of achievement. And then when I think about assessment, what I'm trying to talk about more and more is what would it mean to really anchor our assessment frameworks, not in standardized tests, but in student voice and student agency, the 4 domains of agency that we talk about in chapter 5 of the book. I think that there is so much possibility in those questions, and just staying with those questions, right? And doing the kind of work you're doing too around portrait of a graduate, around performance-based assessment. But we have to interrogate and disrupt some of these assumptions that only the quantitative data tells a story, or that's
Right.
the only kind of data that has value, or that it even really can tell us whether students are successful, right, or not. So I don't know, we could go on this for quite a while, but those are some of my initial thoughts. Feel free to follow up.
No, I think that's it. We have this idea that the quantitative data is the only thing that counts, right? Like, so that was part of the conversation with all of these leaders. We were saying, well, have you talked to your students, and have you gathered pictures and their portfolios, and have you had them tell their stories? And they're like, but that doesn't count. And that keeps just ringing in my ear of that doesn't count. And, my only question is like, why? Of course it counts. It's their experience. So how can we, I think you hit the nail on the head, right sizing it. So being, we're going to have these bigger data sets, and we're going to have these satellite metrics, but right sizing it so it doesn't overshadow the actual experience and the well-being of individual learners who should be at the center of the experience.
Yeah, and here's where I feel like we bump up against a tension between structure and agency. So I'm going to quote my teenager. My teenager took sociology class at University of Victoria in the fall as a high schooler, and he learned about the theory of structure versus agency. And I think it would be foolhardy of us to locate the sole responsibility for this in the school, right? Like the school has agency, yes, and there's institutional kind of bumper or guardrails around that. The structural pieces, they're right? They're sitting inside a system and a structure that values this other kind of data. So this is where I feel like we have to be working on both levels. We have to be pushing the larger system and the folks in policy to rethink, as well as kind of empowering schools and teachers to have more agency around how they think about student voice and assessment.
I love that you just quoted your teenager. I get many of my insights from my kids. Like, just the way they see the world is fascinating, and sometimes simple in a way that's really profound. So again, a good testament to listening to our young people. So we've been talking a little bit, but we've kind of introduced your framework a little bit about satellite data, street data. Can you talk a little bit for people who may or may not really know what you're talking about when you say street data? Talk about what it is and how it can help us be more learner-centered in our work.
Sure, absolutely. So street data was a little idea in The Listening Leader, my first book. I think there's like 3 pages. I'm talking the first chapter about barriers to equity, and one of them is the way that we think about data. And so I had this concept of satellite map and street that was really inspired by work I did in 2008 at the National Equity Project where I used to work, where we were looking at reading data, and we were thinking about, again, like the satellite, the test scores, the kind of map level, running records, and then like sitting side by side with the student and what you learn. And for whatever reason, that few pages of Listening Leader just really caught attention. Like, people were really interested in it and asking more and more for us to unpack that. And so over time, it really felt like it was worth writing a book just about that. And the way that street data is defined in the book is the qualitative data that emerges at our eye level and on higher sound frequencies when we orient ourselves to listen for it and to study it. And the notion here is one of abundance, that the street data is always there, right? It's always around us, but we don't necessarily think about how to gather it. We don't attune to it, right? We don't listen, we don't slow down enough. We don't have that clipboard and kind of capture observations. So it's an invitation early in the book that, we might shift away from being sort of statisticians who are pursuing these little incremental gains, 5% increase in this, 10% decrease in that, toward this much messier, more complex work of being an ethnographer who's just witnessing the learning stories in our community and systematically trying to capture that. And so a couple examples, I talk about in chapter 3, 3 types of street data, which are story or narrative, artifacts like student work or teacher work for that matter, and then observations, right? Just studying and watching and capturing. And a couple of examples of those. For story, you might think about at the simplest level, just an empathy interview one-on-one, right? Where you have some questions and you sit with a student or an adult at the margins, as we say in the book. There's much more complex versions of story gathering, like Kiva panels, right? Or listening campaigns. Even a focus group is a little more complex because you have a group dynamic to navigate. Artifacts, like I said, student work, teacher collaboration agendas, right? Site PD agendas express so much. We step back and analyze them. And then observations, I always encourage folks to do equity-centered learning walks, and not just sort of checking boxes, right? Like, is there a learning target? Is there an objective? But interviewing students, watching who's participating, really attuning to teacher-student interactions through the lens of race and gender, learning difference, and who's called in, who's called out, who gets a lot of corrective feedback, who gets affirmed, what's the culture of belonging in the classroom. So those are some examples, and how street data can sit alongside, but in some ways different, distinct from kind of the quantitative focus we've been situated in.
I mean, there's so much to love about it. When you were talking about the literacy perspective, it reminded me in my teacher education program and learning about anecdotal records and, understanding how young people learn to read, but being able to take that clipboard. And that's where I feel when they say like, it doesn't count, and listening to your accounts of street data, being able to identify the teacher as someone who is a part of the classroom, that your viewpoint and your perspective does count, right? What you're seeing and what students are producing absolutely does count. And that jotting those ideas down and taking those anecdotal records are such a powerful form of data to tell the story of growth, of progress in each individual learner, that I think is also more meaningful. Like when a parent sits down at a parent-teacher conference, I always felt this way, and many tell me the same way. Like you're presented with all these numbers and all this data, and you go, but how's my kid doing? Right? Yeah. But really, how are they doing?
How do they show up in class? What's an example of where they had a breakthrough learning? Where do they seem to be struggling? There's no real formula for any of that. The other thing, just to footnote this, that you made me think of is how much teacher and student agency are symmetrical and interconnected. Yeah. So the way you were describing the role of the teacher, right, is very agentic. There's no scripted curriculum. There's no pacing guide. It requires you to hone a craft as a teacher, which, I think many of us long for the days when it felt like teaching was a craft that, I don't know if it ever had the respect it deserves in this country, but certainly before the punitive testing era, where there was a lot more space for imagination and writing your own curriculum, and not everything was bound, kind of teacher proofing. So this feels so, for our students to be agentic, our teachers need to feel that way as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And have the space to be able to think, right? We're trying to, go through the pacing guide or get so much in just to get to the test. Instead of really deeply understanding. I think of always the best teachers I'm ever around. It's not the pacing guide that they're following or how they, perfectly follow the script in the teaching guide. It is really about how they know their clear outcomes, they know their learners, and they can navigate that day and the instruction and the experience to help everybody get there.
Absolutely.
So in street data, you also had this comment or this passage that resonated. You said, in order to shift the cognitive load, we have to create a culture of inquiry in our classrooms and professional learning. And that ties very much we were just talking about. So when we think about teachers really reimagining their pedagogical practice to take up street data, How do we create the systems for that? What are you seeing in how people are using street data and really rethinking their classrooms to be able to systematically collect this in a way that's telling the story of young people?
It's a great question. So in chapter 4 of street data, we offer a framework for moving through a street data cycle. It's called the equity transformation cycle, which you might have seen. And there's a kind of flexible, adaptive methodology to it, which is first and foremost that we always start with listening at the margins, identifying who's at the margins, whose voices have been least heard, but are most crucial to solving some of the underlying equity challenges that we face. We listen, we gather street data in those areas I talked about before. Then we slow ourselves down and we learn to really uncover what sits beneath street data. So there's, sort of a resistance to quick fixes and easy solutions. And instead, that practice of inquiry at the teacher or leader level, right, is being curious, asking a lot of questions, learning to notice and name kind of no inference to low inference data, right, is a piece of the practice. And then once you've uncovered, you might go back and listen somewhere because you might discover, I don't fully understand this. I don't feel like I'm at a root cause analysis yet. So we need to gather more street data. That's what we're finding often is folks have to go back and do more listening. But at some point you shift into this reimagine place, which is, the counsel in the book is to not reimagine on your own, but to do it in partnership with those you've listened, right? To reimagine, to design with rather than for. And that's probably the most emergent part of the curriculum that we've been building is reimagine. In fact, Jamil and I are working on a module for that right now. It's going to roll out for the first time next week. So all of that can work at any level of the system. Since you asked about pedagogy, let's talk about it at a pedagogical level. So we had the invitation from Jennifer Gonzalez, the Cult of Pedagogy founder, to do sort of like a pro bono series working with 2 teacher teams through the cycle, videotaping it, and then sharing that. And those just got shared. You might have seen on social media about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago. So it's free. It's like 9 hours of content. Awesome. I don't know if anyone is going to watch it, but she's amazing. And it was a really cool idea. And we learned so much by getting just really in the weeds with these 2 groups of teachers who are trying to transform their practice. And I mean, I could draw on so many examples from that, but, one I can think of, Amanda, who was on the sort of post series podcast with Jennifer and me and Jamila, just talked about ways that she reoriented her practice based on the feedback from the group of Indigenous students she spent a lot of time with. And they were practices like having them co-teach elements of the class, really valuing and centering storytelling. The young people wanted to bring elders from their community in, so she began to do that. So there's these ways in which she's trying to cultivate more joy in the classroom and more ownership, especially by the Indigenous students in her class. And it started showing up in concrete shifts, right? But the last thing I'll say is it's so important, I think, not to get caught up just in the technical. The technical is super important, and the mindset piece is so important. And those teachers were able to speak so articulately about ways they changed their perspective, their mindset, right? Ways that they were able to catch themselves in dominant ways of being and kind of slow down and show up differently. So I don't know if that helps at all to answer your question, because it's so complex. It's hard. It's not a linear thing, but those are some of the tools we've been playing with teachers.
It's not a linear thing, and it is complex, but at the same time, it boils down to what we started with: simply stopping, pausing to listen, right? Instead of just going on with the way I think it should be, what my idea of a teacher is, what my idea of a classroom is, or being effective. It requires, you're saying, slow down, stop, disrupt that way of thinking by listening to what your actions, the impact of your actions on others, right? And I think that is a story I hear all too often, that we go into education because we care about young people, right? We as teachers and leaders in the system want kids to be successful, and our own perceptions of what that is forces us to act in ways that are actually not serving our goals.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a great summary.
So you said something earlier that I want to circle back to. You said you've been wrestling with the idea of success, and even if that's the right word. So tell me more. What are you thinking about, and how are you working through success, or what, if that's even the right metric? Because I've been wrestling with this too. So I'm curious.
Yeah, I don't have a really formulated answer to this, but I think just sometimes I look at that word and it feels like an artifact of the colonial paradigm, in that, you know, there's an implicit sense that only some people can be quote unquote successful. And the way we're going to measure that is through grades, it's through college access, it's through these kind of, you know, traditional systems measures. And I would never suggest that those things don't matter. Again, the argument is it's not an either or. I think we're really aspiring to more of a both and way of thinking. But, you know, is it even possible in the current paradigm to create a community in which every child is successful?
Yeah.
Or do we have it baked into the formula that some are going to fail, right? That some are going to struggle. You know, teachers who have a lot of, for example, A's and B's in their class are often questioned, like, where are the kids who are failing? Where are the D's and F's? And I just don't know that I want to subscribe to that anymore. You know, it feels kind of toxic. I have, my own children are not very traditional learners. And so even in my own home, I grapple with, well, what are my metrics of success for my kids, right? And how do we create a spirit of what I talk about in chapter 4 of the book, of radical inclusion around the possibility of thriving? Because there are so many ways, right, to thrive as a human being, and they're not all measurable in the ways that we tend to measure success. Does that make any sense?
Oh, it makes so much sense. And, you know, my mind is spinning because I wrestle with the same thing. My kids prior to the pandemic were in a charter school. They didn't have grades. So we, you know, and they were by all accounts thriving. They had great self-esteem. They were engaged in their projects. They had friends. And we were really thrilled with their experience, as were they. And after the pandemic, we moved for a variety of reasons back to their traditional local neighborhood school. And my kids came home with grades that were not traditionally successful. And we had to go, oh my gosh, we forgot you're back in a traditional system. We forgot to reorient expectations and talk about this. And we're still navigating that, and what it means to be successful, and what we really want to focus on. So I would tell my kids, I don't care about your grades. I care that you are trying hard, that you are being a good human, that you are developing a work ethic, and you're, you know, there's a difference between the work being hard and you just not showing up and putting your full effort. So we have to kind of disentangle those things. So I found myself, though, asking my daughter, like, what did you get on your math test or whatever? And she's like, Mom, why is that what you keep asking me? Why are you oriented to that? You said you care about all these other things. So she's catching me in this. And I was like, because that's what gets sent home to me, right? So I had to also step back and say, what do I care about? Because the reports I'm getting are simply grade metrics. And it is disorienting when that's what you have to look at. So I like your idea of redefining success and really thinking about what success actually means. And are you familiar with the work of Todd Rose and Collective Illusions? So it's a great book. I would highly recommend it. But he talks about the collective illusion that success is wealth, status, power, that there's really the majority of people, I forget what it is, but it's the overwhelming majority of people, 70, 80%, don't subscribe to that for themselves. So if I were to ask you, we're having this conversation, we say, that's not what success means to me and my family, but the majority of people think that that's what other people subscribe to. So we're operating around this collective illusion of what success is, instead of actually talking about what the majority of us care about, which is well-being, which is a sense of self, which is purpose. But because our traditional metrics don't align to that, we often focus on what we think other people care about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I will definitely check it out. Thanks for sharing that resource.
So it gives me hope again to think about redefining success and what that could look like if we really started to have these conversations in community about what we really value and start orienting towards those for our kids.
And even that would be a great use of the equity transformation cycle at a systems level, right? So a superintendent or an executive team of a district could work through that process tool, starting with who do we need to listen to actually radically reimagine how we're defining success and think about new sort of metrics or ways of orienting, and then moving through all those pieces I described.
So I've already read a few parts of your book to you, but I love it. So I have one last quote that I was like reading through it, and all I did was just like bracket this like paragraph and was like, yes, I love this. And so I think it really aligns to this conversation around redefining success. So you said, if we accept that success can be defined in a metric, if we hold true that a child's test score, a grade point average, are a determinant of her future, we will find ourselves forever suspended in a hamster wheel chasing external solutions, curricula, and validation. Like exclamation point, full 100%. I see that. And I think it's important. And then you go on to say, but if we believe that every student is more than a number or a trauma story, is in fact a complex, layered human being with endless potential, brilliance, and access to community cultural wealth, we can choose a pedagogy, a voice that transforms everything from our classrooms to our adult cultures and policies. So people listening are probably going, yes, Shane, that's right. That's what we want to do. But it's also big, right? It's also this big aspirational thing. And we have the system that's saying, but parents don't want this, but kids need the basics. So what do you say? How do we start to really shift this system and think about moving towards those metrics that really matter?
Well, first of all, it's just funny to hear one's writing reflected back. It just took me into the moment of writing that passage. And I remember just agonizing over the wording of that and the location of that. And, in some ways, that's like one of the thesis statements in the book right there that you just called out. I think it's so important where you're bringing us to closure, Katie, that we don't get overwhelmed by the enormity of the task, and that I have chills thinking about this, that we understand ourselves as part of a long line of people who are trying to do this work, right? The Iroquois Confederacy called it the 7 generations, that we don't get paralyzed, but we start somewhere, right? We take it up somewhere. And so that really depends on your location in the system. If you're in the classroom, I think it's, if it's helpful to you, looking at chapter 5 of the book, certainly working with Goldie Muhammad's brilliant work around curriculum design, cultivating genius, and her new book, Unearthing Joy, and just thinking about, how do I start to move in this direction of student voice? How do I reimagine my curriculum to bring in elements of identity and belonging and joy? If you're, a school leader, there's a lot of guidance in the book as well around what does it mean to listen at the margins within my school? Who are the teacher voices that I need to listen to, right? Who are the parent and community and caregiver voices I need to listen to? And I think, to the earlier point in this conversation, of giving ourselves permission to slow down and not have an answer all the time, to be suspended in the unknowing, the not knowing, to really nest ourselves in questions in that place of inquiry. All of that is modeling, right? Like when you do that as a leader or you do that as a teacher, you're activating mirror neurons in the other person, and you're showing rather than telling what your value is. I value your voice. I value your experience. I value even just the time with you, setting aside 20 minutes or 30 minutes without my phone, without an agenda, to just be with you as a human being. I think we can transform our cultures, really, conversation by conversation. I think we can transform our classrooms lesson by lesson, unit by unit, assessment by assessment. And I think as we do that, we build momentum and we build a groundswell of energy and a refusal to be limited in our imagination in the way the current system limits us.
Love it. That was a perfect kind of closure to a really awesome conversation that I've been looking forward to having for a while. Grateful for just your thoughts and brilliance. I want to take us through a quick rapid fire few questions, and then we'll close up. So
I'm gonna learn from you, because Alcina and I struggle with the rapid fire. It ends up taking not at all a rapid amount of time.
we'll see what we could do. All right. So what's one thing we should stop doing in education?
Behavior charts, red, yellow, green,
Yes.
rewarding or punishing behavior. It's
Oh my gosh. Love it. What is one thing we should start doing?
One-on-one empathy interviews, listening sessions, and conferring with students.
Yes. What should we keep doing?
Should we keep doing? For those who do this, building time into our master schedules for teachers to collaborate.
Yes. Meaningfully. Absolutely. You mentioned a few different projects, but what's something that you are focusing on learning or doing right now?
What does it mean to have teams of students take up this street data work? Working with 50 grade 11 students outside Vancouver who are in high school teams, and then taking them through the cycle. And it's really powerful and a lot of learning for me as well.
Awesome. Can't wait to learn more. What's one thing that many people don't know about you?
Oh, that's a great question. I think about that. Maybe that I had the privilege to take June Jordan's last Poetry for the People class at UC Berkeley before she transitioned. I was a young teacher on fellowship, and yeah, really, really gifted in that moment to be able to witness her as a teacher and write some poetry.
Awesome. What is your favorite quote or saying that resonates with you?
I mean, basically anything written by James Baldwin, but certainly the passage of A Talk to Teachers, his famous talk from the late 50s, I believe, or late 60s, where he talks about how the purpose of education is to learn how to ask questions and to push back. But at the same time, no society really wants that kind of person around.
And here we are.
Here we are.
Yes. All right. Last two. What are you really grateful for right now?
I am so grateful to be living on these lands here in Victoria, the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen people, and to get to learn from Indigenous educators and thought leaders in the province about what a whole different kind of system could look like, and have my child finish his education here when it was quite difficult in the States for him.
That sounds amazing. Last question. What is your hope for the future of education? No big deal.
I hope that we just break through the incarceration of the imagination and give ourselves permission to think and dream and imagine really big, and do that with students, and do that in a way that honors teachers.
Perfect. Well, Shane, thank you for joining me and for sharing your work, your aspirations, and lots of great ideas that I think educators can take with them. And like, as you said, start now. It doesn't have to be something far off, that we all can start now. So thank you very much.
I appreciate having come today and spending some time with you, Katie. Thank you.